So I think a lot of the discussion in Australia has taken place on a false premise that we're way out in front, that we're doing things that no one else is doing. We're amongst the developed countries, we're in the second half of the pack, and the others who are in the second half with us are moving with similar tribulations to us, and Japan, the United States, well, Japan's already done a lot in other ways, but with its focus on greenhouse gas emissions reductions and introduction of something like an emissions trading scheme, the timing might end up being similar to the United States and Australia. But even if that premise were right, even if it were true that we were right out in front of the rest of the world with our moves to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increasing the costs of certain trade-exposed emissions-intensive industries, even if that premise were right, the analysis would not lead us to the conclusion that the right way of dealing with the problem was to compensate firms for the fact that we had a price on carbon when others didn't. And I can illustrate that point by explaining that if everyone had the same carbon tax as us, if there were no free riding, there would be pressure on the competitiveness of some firms in some industries because some trade-exposed emissions-intensive industries, including the one that's by far underway the most important in the Australian emissions profile, aluminium smelting, some of these are produced through more emissions-intensive processes in Australia than they would be in the places where the industry would expand if the whole world had a similar carbon price. If the whole world had a high and similar carbon price, then what the Chinalco chairman said to me a year ago would be being said by in the boardrooms of all of the major aluminium producers in the world. In fact, these things are being said in all of the boardrooms of all the major aluminium producing countries in the world. The future of aluminium smelting for some time will be in those locations that can use low emissions energy and which don't currently have high value alternative uses. Sources like the 10,000 megawatts of power potential in the Parari River Valley in Papua New Guinea, probably comparable amounts of power potential in the Kakori and Strickland rivers. BHP is looking at huge hydro potential for smelting in the Congo. Iceland, with its geothermal and hydroelectric capacity, is emerging as an important location for expansion of aluminium smelting. If the whole world had the same carbon price, then there'd be strong pressures for contraction of coal-based aluminium smelting, and at the margin, the expansion of smelting activity would occur in low emission sources, especially those that are a long way from current uses in industrial countries. We are tending to see in the domestic debate any contraction of our emissions-intensive industries as somehow a distortion. We're seeing the response to the competitiveness problem of it being thought that we're going to have much higher carbon pricing than others. We're seeing the right response as being to compensate our producers for the fact that we've got a carbon tax, and so you've got the debate about free permits. With the very emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries getting free for some time a high proportion of their permits. There's quite a lot of arbitrariness in the proposal for allocation of free permits, as there must be, because it is not based on a satisfactory principle. And the right principle in economics, it would be to compensate Australian or American or Japanese or European producers for the fact that the rest of the world did not have a comparable carbon price, rather than for the fact that they did have one. In that way, if you were compensating for the fact that other countries did not have a carbon price, you were systematically subsidising for the difference that others not having a comparable carbon price made to world prices for the product. You would retain incentives for expansion of capacity only in places where you did have genuine comparative advantage, when comparative advantage was calculated by the external costs of emissions. Such a system would take into account in a systematic way the fact that quite a lot of countries are doing quite a lot. That would come out in the assessments, and it would automatically phase out as other countries did more. This was the proposal that I made in chapter 14, in a box 14.5 in the report. Ron Ben David, the head of the Secretariat, here with me today, and remembering all the work that went into box 14.5. So it's rather an elegant presentation of the issues, I think. I think that the difference between arbitrary allocation of free permits, which we're talking about now and which you really have with the proposals in the Waxman Bill in the United States, and which you've had for some time in Europe, and a principles-based basis for support for the trade-exposed emission-intensive industries is profound. The difference is profound in its effects on the world trade system and the distortions that would be avoided in the world trade system. We should keep in mind that when dealing with assistance to trade-exposed emissions-intensive industries for the fact that others don't have comparable carbon pricing, we're dealing with something that we should think of as a transitional problem. The transition will be over. The case for any support at all would disappear as soon as all countries had similar, or substantial countries. It doesn't matter very much what very small developing countries do, but it certainly matters a lot what big developing countries like China, India, Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil do. The case for any support for trade-exposed emission-intensive industries would disappear as soon as those substantial developing countries had comparable carbon pricing. And the straightforward way of getting comparable carbon pricing would be for all of those countries to accept some sort of cap on emissions. It can be a very different basis for the cap on emissions in different countries. Could even allow growth in emissions in some low-income developing countries like India for a considerable period within principles that made sense for the world as a whole, and which added up to a solution to the problem of high risks of dangerous climate change. You could get comparable pricing even if the basis for setting targets was quite different in different countries, so long as you can trade internationally entitlements to emissions, because the trade in entitlements, even if the basis for entitlements is very different in different countries, the trade in entitlements will give you similar carbon prices across countries, and the case disappears for any support for trade-exposed emissions-intensive industries. In 14.5 of the report and in the principles I'm articulating this evening, we're talking about transitional arrangements until you've got that comparable carbon pricing. There's been quite a lot of discussion of other ways of dealing with the problem of differential approaches to carbon pricing against countries affecting the competitiveness of different industries. I've already talked about the problem in arbitrary allocation of free permits. Some people argue that a comparable carbon tax across all countries would handle the problem. Well, it would if everyone handled this problem, if all countries had a similar carbon tax. But that would require international agreement of comparable difficulty to negotiating comprehensively a set of targets for emissions reduction. And there are some special challenges in getting uniform carbon taxes. As Jeff Frankel pointed out in an important article last year, there are issues of verification of whether a carbon tax is additional. It can be compensated by reduction in other taxes. And it's also harder to legitimately differentiate between countries through application of a carbon tax. You can't have different carbon pricing in different countries, or you don't achieve the trade objective. And so you're unable to introduce the differentiation of effort between countries at different levels of development that becomes possible if you've got different bases for allocating entitlements to emit, and you get the unification of price through trade in the permits. Recently in Australia there's been a lot of discussion, mainly promoted by Jeff Carmody, of a consumption-based system where it operates like the ETS, except it's not value added you're taxing, it's carbon. And like the ETS, you would tax imports on the basis of the carbon content. And that's interesting in principle, but I think there are a couple of very large difficulties. The first one, and a very big one, is that it would have to be operating globally or it couldn't work. And the world as a whole has been heading in a different direction. We'd have to start again. And there's not much prospect of that in the immediate future. There also would be huge difficulties of actually calculating the carbon intensity of a particular product. A ton of aluminium from China might come from filthy coal in the northeast, high emissions coal in the northeast, or it might come from hydroelectric power on the Yangtze. And if you are trying to tax in a different way the carbon content, then it won't take very long for them to make sure that you think that the aluminium coming in came from the hydroelectric and not the coal-based smelter. The administrative complexity of it is considerable. It's an idea that has some attractions, but I think even on the criterion of complexity, it and its administration, it's difficult compared with the proposal that I've suggested. So to bring things to a conclusion, I think this is a really big issue. I think that if we don't find a principled way of supporting trade-exposed emissions-intensive industries that is environmentally and economically efficient, then this is going to become the basis for effectively protectionist claims in many jurisdictions. The protection will take different forms. One will be fairly unlimited payment of handing out of free permits with very large budgetary and income distribution dimensions. But there'll also be strong pressures for taxes at the border against import from countries which are thought to be more lenient on taxing emissions, and this won't be done through some fine judicial process. It'll be arbitrated through a political process in which there's all sorts of scope for protectionist increases in penalties. That element's there in the Waxman bill posed by the Obama administration, but with a strong head of steam behind it on Capitol Hill. It's there in the Brussels proposals for post-2013 arrangements. I think that unless we find a principled approach to this issue, we're going to invite further big distortions of the international trading system. It's probably too late for us unilaterally ourselves to adopt a principled approach to assistance for trade-exposed emission-intensive industries. It was the possible approach was laid out in detail in my report. There was absolutely no business interest in it because business was not very interested in an economically efficient regime. The debate was all about who got the advantage in allocation of free permits, and that's been the only real discussion within business over the last year or so. So I think, and we're probably quite close to having an ETS legislated, so it's probably too late to start again within Australia, and so focus has to be given to having some principles agreed internationally. And I've had a couple of chats with Pascal Lamy, and we'll be seeing him again in Geneva in a few weeks' time on this issue, because there's the same recognition in Geneva as there is amongst people who worry about these issues here of the huge potential for adding to a weakened multilateral trading system, a new set of distortions and temptations for further distortions. Thanks.